This is the face of a man the world tried to erase. In 1828, a young artist painted what would become the only surviving image of a prince in exile. Look closely at the eyes of Abdul Rahman Ibrahima Sori. You aren't looking at a victim, you are looking at a veteran. A man who, at the age of 66, could still recite complex legal codes, speak 5 languages, and map the stars of the West African sky from memory. But to understand the weight in those eyes, we must travel back 60 years to a land where he was a sovereign. In 1788, returning from a military campaign, the prince was ambushed in the narrow passes of the Futa Jallon mountains. He was sold for rum and tobacco. In that moment, the Prince of Timbo ceased to exist in the eyes of the world. As his kingdom faded, he made a silent vow. They could take his crown, but never the Quran engraved upon his heart. Sold to a frontiersman in Mississippi, the prince was forced into the fields. They mocked him by calling him prince, not knowing the truth. But he mastered the land. Using West African techniques, he turned a struggling farm into the most productive in the region. For 40 years, he lived a double life, a field hand by day and a scholar of the Deen by night. The hidden scholar was biding his time. In the year 1807, the town of Natchez, Mississippi, was a frontier of broken dreams and sudden fortunes. For 19 years, Abdul Rahman Ibrahima Sori had lived as a shadow. To the locals, he was simply Prince, a hard-working man who grew the best sweet potatoes in the county. But his heart remained anchored in the highlands of Futa, Jallon. On a sweltering Tuesday, he was sent into town to sell produce, a routine task, a moment of brief freedom. But as he adjusted his reins, he looked up and saw a ghost. Walking toward him through the crowd of frontiersmen and merchants was a ghost. The man was Dr. John Coates Cox, an Irish surgeon who had spent years traveling the world. As their eyes locked, the bustling market of Mississippi dissolved. For Dr. Cox, the man standing before him was not a slave in ragged clothes. He was a memory of a life-saving mercy. Decades earlier, Dr. Cox had been stranded on the coast of West Africa, dying of fever. He had been found by the soldiers of Futa Jallon and nursed back to health by the royal family. The man who had sat by his bedside, who had ordered the finest doctors to save him, was the prince himself. Now the roles were inverted. The prince who had saved the doctor's life was now a captive in the doctor's own world. Cox stepped forward, asking the question, Are you the Prince of Timbo?" Abdul Rahman did not beg. He simply nodded with the poise of a king who had never truly lost his throne. Dr. Cox was overwhelmed with a debt he could never fully repay. Cox immediately went to Thomas Foster, offering any price for freedom. But Foster, seeing the prince as his most valuable asset, refused. But the hidden scholar was no longer invisible. Word began to spread through the drawing rooms of Natchez. Among them lived a man more educated than most of his masters combined. Abdul Rahman began to write letters in fluent Arabic, destined for the Sultan of Morocco and the United States Department of State. The prince was no longer just a field hand, he was a political emergency. The silent scholar was about to force the President of the United States to make a choice that would echo across the Atlantic. In the deep, humid silence of the Mississippi nights, a war was being fought that no one could see. After 40 years, the prince finally had access to a weapon he had been denied: ink and paper. This was not the writing of a broken man, it was the calligraphy of a master. To the locals, these looked like mystic symbols. They had no idea they were looking at the sophisticated legal language of a global civilization. Abdul Rahman was writing his own passport. He drafted a letter, not to a local judge, but to the Sultan of Morocco. He was asserting his status as a political equal to the kings of the world. The letter traveled a path that borders on the miraculous. From a small cabin in Natchez, across the Atlantic, until it finally landed on the desk of the Sultan in Marrakesh. By 1826, the case of the enslaved prince had reached the highest office in the land. President John Quincy Adams and Secretary of State Henry Clay found themselves in a diplomatic nightmare. Here was a man legally owned by a Mississippi farmer who was now a personal interest of a foreign monarch. The hidden scholar of Mississippi had created a geopolitical crisis. Henry Clay demanded the prince's release. Foster refused. He realized that the prince was a symbol of an uncomfortable truth, that his property possessed a history and literacy that far surpassed his own. In 1828, the order finally came from Washington. Abdul Rahman was to be freed. But there was a cruel catch. He must leave the United States immediately and never return. This meant leaving his children and his grandchildren behind in the very chains he was finally escaping. The prince stood at the crossroads of his life. He was 66 years old. He stepped off the plantation not as a freed slave, but as a returning sovereign. As he began his journey toward the coast, thousands gathered to see the man of the century. The orange glow of the south was fading, and the Atlantic, the same ocean that had brought him in chains, was now the only thing standing between him and the home he had never forgotten. Freedom is a heavy burden when those you love are still in chains. In the year 1828, Abdul Rahman Ibrahima Sori did not simply flee for the coast. He became a phenomenon. From the drawing rooms of Philadelphia to the lecture halls of New York, the enslaved prince became the most famous man in America. He stood before massive crowds, not as a victim seeking pity, but as a scholar demanding justice. He wore his traditional robes and his white turban, a visual defiance of the stereotypes of his era. He was a master of the stage. He would write the Fatiha in beautiful Maghrebi script and hand it to the onlookers, who, unable to read it, thought they were receiving a mysterious Lord's Prayer. He was raising money, cent by cent, dollar by dollar, to buy the freedom of his children and grandchildren left behind in Mississippi. This was his final campaign, his last battle of the banners. But the clock was ticking. The U.S. government was growing nervous. They wanted the prince gone before his story could spark a revolution among the thousands of other hidden scholars. The departure from the port of Norfolk in 1829 was a scene of staggering emotional weight. Abdul Rahman stood on the deck of the Harriet, a ship destined for Liberia. Beside him stood his loyal wife, Isabella. But as the anchor was raised, the prince looked back at the receding shoreline. His children were not there. He was leaving his blood in the soil of Mississippi. At 67 years old, the prince was a man caught between two worlds. He was returning to his homeland as a hero, yet he was leaving as a broken-hearted father. As the ship hit the deep blue of the Atlantic, the same ocean that had stolen his youth 40 years prior, Abdul Rahman turned his face toward the east. He began his prayers. He was no longer a Moor or a slave. He was a freeman of the Ummah, navigating by the stars he had studied as a boy in the libraries of Timbo. When the Harriet finally docked on the coast of Africa, Abdul Rahman Ibrahima Sori did not find the kingdom he had left. His father was gone. His brothers were gone. Futa Jallon was a memory. But as his feet touched the warm, golden sand of his continent for the first time in 4 decades, the prince did the only thing a scholar of his stature could do. He fell to his knees. He died just months after his return, but his legacy was already etched in history. Today, his manuscripts remain in the Library of Congress, silent, elegant proofs of a prince who refused to forget who he was. The orange glow of his story does not end in a grave. It lives in every verse of the Quran recited in the West today. He was the ultimate witness to the resilience of the soul,